Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of This Week in Global Development. My name is Rumbi Chakamba and I'll be your host for this week. And it's been quite the week. I'm not even sure where to start this week round, but I'm joined by Kumar, who is our CEO and editor-in-chief, as well as Elissa Miolene, who is our global development reporter, to kind of break down everything that's been happening. So this week has been a big week for the US, obviously, with Trump's inauguration and the 200 executive actions that followed after that. And our reporters have been hard at work trying to break down what this all means for global development. I think a good place to start is probably the 90-day funding freeze on foreign assistance. And my colleague, Michael Igo has got a wonderful report on that kind of explains what's in the executive order and what it means. And unfortunately, it also brought up a lot of questions as opposed to answers. First of all, does this apply to people who've already carried out work and are expecting payment? Does this apply to humanitarian assistance? And there's a talk of a review of programs that the US is carrying out, and Donald Trump spoke about a lot of foreign assistance not being in line with American values. Will this mean a review of programs that we're expecting to be cut anyway? For example, climate change and family planning program, or is this a wider review, and what does that mean? You guys are both at Davos, and I'm assuming that Trump has taken center stage because of everything that's happening in DC right now. Raj, could you give us some of the reactions that people have to this particular funding freeze? And also from what you're hearing and what you've read from the executive order, how do you imagine this is going to play out?
Yeah, it's snowing and beautiful here in Davos, Rumbi. So it looks gorgeous on the outside. On the inside, though, there's a lot of anxiety in the conference rooms. I'm joining you all from a conference room here in Microsoft's Pavilion, right across from the main Congress Hall. And there's a buzz, there's energy, but honestly, it's a lot more subdued, I feel like, than prior years. And I think a good part of that has to do with the fear and the uncertainty, particularly among people working in global development and humanitarian issues. Just that fear and uncertainty about what do these orders mean, even though we don't know the details. And I would commend people listening to check out the special session our colleague Michael Igo led yesterday for our pro audience that really gets into the details on this. But even though we don't know all the details, the trend line is kind of clear. And you can just see the deep skepticism around the way foreign assistance is structured, around the budget sizes, that deep skepticism playing out in budget cuts, in pullbacks. Exactly how they'll be administered is still unclear, but we can see the direction, and it looks to be much more severe than the first term, the first time President Trump was in office. And so you can just sense that's kind of casting a pall across, everybody here. I actually yesterday interviewed a right-wing politician from Europe, and we'll be releasing a podcast on that soon. But it was just interesting to get into that mindset. I think you see what's happening in Washington happening across Europe too, that there's this more right-wing populist view about foreign assistance, and it's bleeding into the multilateral institutions and into international organizations. So there's a lot of trepidation. My own take is most of the negative impact here is going to hit UN agencies and other international orgs. I think they're in real trouble, including the ones who implement programs on behalf of the US government, which is a lot of them. I think that the MDBs and the DFIs, they seem to be in a better position. I think they're more likely to come through this. And then I think there will be some organizations that are just very heavily dependent on USAID funding, where it's 90% or even more of their funding, that are going to find themselves in a particular squeeze, especially if the 90 days were to get extended or if they can't get a waiver during this period. So there is a lot of concern, and it's for good reason.
And Elissa, I'm wondering if you're hearing the same things, the concern that Raj is talking about, and what are organizations saying there?
100%. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of double lives going on at the moment right now in Davos. I think there is what's happening and being chatted about on the promenade and in private conversations, and then there's what's said on stage. I think those are two completely different realities. So Raj really touched on what's being said off stage. And I think I've had the same kind of conversations. I've spoken with several heads of UN agencies, UNDP and UNFPA. And I think there's certainly this sense of, yes, what's going to happen? We're waiting on, the edge of our seat. We're, really expecting the UN to take a hit. But on stage, I think people are very, very careful right now. I was in a conversation or a session at Davos just a couple of days ago where there were a few folks very high up at the World Bank. And, I think the question was posed about, all right, this is all about climate. What do you think about Trump pulling out of Paris? And the answer was, we'll figure it out. We always do. And I think that figure it out, we'll always do is really translating into this dodge question. And I think it's like people are on edge for many different reasons here. That's the feeling I'm getting. So kind of to echo Raj, but also just draw that line between what's said and what's not said and in which different scenarios. I think we're all thinking it, especially in the global development community, a bit just about what's happening here. What can we expect? What does this mean? As you said, Rumbi, earlier. But yeah, it's an interesting environment right now, I think.
I'd just add to that, Elissa, I totally agree that I've had these private conversations with some leaders of international organizations, and they're debating what their strategy should be. On the one hand, is it better to just be quiet and be under the radar? Maybe you don't want to be noticed at a time when people are cutting. Or is it better to be really proactive and try to position your work and organization in a way that shows that you're doing the kinds of things an America First agenda might appreciate? Like you work a lot with the private sector, you do a lot of innovation, you actually deliver a lot of return on investment. So there's kind of a debate about how to position. And some people are talking about changing their language. Like, let's not talk about climate. Let's talk about the effects of climate, right? And their argument would be, look, we got to focus on the people we're trying to serve in it. We might feel better by voicing our views really loud, but if it means we can't ultimately serve people who are in need, are we helping them? Whereas I've talked to other leaders who say, this is the time to stand up. We need to use our voice. It's a very tough situation that people find themselves in. And we're just reminded, because we knew this was coming, but we're just reminded when it hits how big the United States is as a funder. It sort of funds the whole ecosystem. It's so big, especially in global health. And so it's having real shockwaves even here across the world in Davos.
Speaking of global health and the sort of strategy of trying to figure out what do we say, what can we say at this particular time, I have to turn to WHO. Trump also announced day one that the US will be pulling out of WHO. We were expecting this. And in the lead up to this, I think WHO was refraining from speaking about it. It was basically no comment until it finally happened. And it's a very interesting sort of release that they put out there that they regret this action. They hope that the US can come back to the table and that they can continue this partnership. But it's going to have a big impact on the organization. We can't deny it. The US funds like 15% of the current budget. Currently for this year, I think the WHO is 90% funded, but that takes into account money from the US. We don't know whether or not they're going to lose the money straight away. It's supposed to take a year, but there's no guarantee that it's going to take a year with Trump. Are you hearing anything specifically in the global health space, and how are people thinking of this? And are there any sort of discussions around how we can cover this money that's going to be lost regardless?
I would just add, you're right, there's still some lack of clarity here, but my reading of the executive order and a lot of the other people I talked to here feel like there was a spectrum of ways that Trump could have pulled the US out of the WHO. And he and his team basically picked the worst part of that spectrum. They went as extreme as they can. So instead of pulling out in a new way, which would mean they have to wait a year, they're claiming that they're just restating, they're going back to the old time in 2021, I guess, when they last pulled out. So they say, well, the time has elapsed. That year has elapsed. So we don't have to wait another year. They're also, it seems in my reading and from others I've spoken to here, that the way the funding cycle works is the US government funds in arrears. So the WHO spends all their money, and then the US government funds at the end of January what the WHO spent the prior year. So they're waiting on their 2024 money. And my understanding is that this executive order means Trump will not pay them for what they already spent in 2024. So it's worse even than the way it initially was conceived, that it's more of an immediate pullout. It's more of, money that was actually owed, not future money not being paid, in addition to future money not being paid. If all of that holds true, it's going to be really debilitating for the organization. It's hard to imagine that they can continue doing the kind of work that they do without some pretty severe disruption. And it's worth noting, they have to deal with this. At the same time, they deal with lots of other crises around the world, right? So Dr. Tedros was supposed to be here. He ended up having to stay in Tanzania for the Marburg outbreak. And you've got a number of other WHO leaders here. I've spoken to many of them. And I would say the mood is, shocked. They are really feeling it. They knew it was coming, but to come at the most severe end of that spectrum and to have it turn to a real thing instead of just an idea, I think it's been really shocking for people.
I think I'll just.
Elissa, I want to come to you as well, but I've got an additional question that I want to throw in there. There's a lot of talk about philanthropy and how it could help fill some of these gaps. And it sounds catastrophic, and it sounds like the gaps are going to be so many. Are you hearing anything about the role that philanthropy can play from this moment going onwards?
Yeah, I think so. It's a really important question, Rumbi. But before we get there, I do just want to add one thing to Raj's point, which was the expansiveness of some of these announcements that President Trump is making. And we're also waiting, I just want to point out, for Mexico City policy, which is something that's very much expected to come in the coming days. But folks that I've spoken to have really been saying, okay, well, we're kind of expecting potentially something similar, right? As Raj has said, like a clawback of money. This refers to the Mexico City policy, for those that don't know, is something that kind of flip-flops back and forth between Republican and Democratic administrations. But last time Trump was in office, he expanded it. So it essentially made it that no money going toward, if the U.S. already does not allow funding of abortion or abortion-related activities because of a previous law. But this particular amendment makes it so that if Europe is funding something and there's a little bit of U.S. money in that bucket, it can't be used for abortion-related activities. So all that to be said is that's another thing that I'm kind of hearing whispers and wondering about whether that there will be a clawback in the more expanded version. So we'll be reporting on that, obviously, and have more to come on that when and if it does drop. But just something to add. In relation to your question on philanthropy, I think so. Yes, but given that we're at Davos, I think that there's just been much more attention for the private sector, and really kind of angling that question toward, okay, who's going to fill the gaps? Companies. And I think whether that's idealist or, perhaps that is picking up and working traction this week. I was at an event a couple days ago where Peter Sands of the Global Fund announced that his new target was $2 billion from the private sector alone to fill his work and to replenish it in the midst of all these aid cuts. So I'm hearing much more about private sector and private sector engagement than I am about philanthropy, but I'll keep my ears open going forward too.
I do think, though, when Peter Sands says private sector, he actually is including philanthropy. I could be wrong about that, but I think he is. I think that $2 billion target includes several hundred million from the Gates Foundation.
There we go.
So he wants to raise a lot more, obviously. And historically, Global Fund has raised some money from companies, but it's been hard. And companies, corporate philanthropy is not growing at the rate of individual philanthropy by any means. And, to me, one of the interesting things, and actually it's funny that we're having this conversation in this Microsoft Cafe meeting room. You all can't see it as you're on the YouTube version of this. Get a little bit of a sense, but literally in the room next to me, there's some billionaire philanthropist meetings. Talk about donating more money. We'll see if anything comes of that, because every year it's like this at Davos. I've got to be in some of those rooms. There's a lot of conversation, but at the end of the day, it's still mostly the same small list of philanthropists that are doing almost everything. And obviously at the top of that list is the Gates Foundation, which is now, on track to do $9 billion a year, more than most governments. But there's still many, many others, even many who signed the Giving Pledge, that are exploring, they're studying, they're dabbling, but they're not stepping up to do the kind of thing that Peter Sands want to see them do, fund big evidence-based opportunities where they could get rid of enough of their money to actually make a dent in their philanthropic plans. So I think one thing that shifted, at least in my thinking, the argument used to be here in Davos and more broadly, philanthropy is always going to be a small piece of the pie. And so it has to be really strategic. It has to target very specific risk-taking ideas, and then it will bring in government. And it's going to be the governments of the global north that fund it, and then ultimately governments of the global south that fund it. But philanthropy is too small to really fill the gaps. That's no longer a credible argument. There is now enough money at the very top to actually fill the gaps left by government funding. The question is, will it? And it really is an open question. We see more philanthropy than ever. Michael Bloomberg last year gave away, I think, $3 billion. So that's the level of many governments. So, there is money there and more is happening, but still much of it is on the sidelines.
Understandably. So I think someone in the WHO story highlighted that the gap left by the US would be like less than 8% of the current Gates budget. But Gates is already the second largest funder to the WHO. So it's who else is on the sidelines? Who else can step up and kind of fill this role? And in terms of private investment, I would want to give credit to WHO in the sense that they've been trying. And I think a lot of people have been doing this to bring in like that private sector investment. They set up WHO Foundation as a means to sort of court the private sector. But at the end of the day, when you look at it, it's like they receive 62% of their funding from 10 donors. So it's still sort of like coming from the same sort of space. And who are we seeing and who are people sort of eyeing and who do you think is going to make that difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure there is anyone who will. I think these organizations might just shrink. I mean, when I interviewed this right-wing politician, that's sort of what he said is like, these organizations, like countries are probably not going to step up and fill these gaps. Now, I think it depends on the agency you're talking about. So in my view, something like the Global Fund or Gavi, which is also seeking its replenishment, those are places where if billionaire philanthropists really stepped up in a big way, I think that would be great and maybe have less of a legitimacy problem than something like the WHO. I wondered if the Gates Foundation even wants to be the biggest donor, even if they could fill the gap, as you say, they technically it's a relatively small part of their total budget. Does the world want its normative health body to be primarily funded by an individual or a private foundation? Shouldn't it be a coalition of governments? So I think there are going to be some kinds of funding, some organizations that just make more sense for government to step up and others that might make more sense for philanthropy. And I think all of this is happening so rapidly with elections in Germany coming up that it's just hard to know whether there's time to sort of sort this out. But I hope the longer term landscape that you'd see much more private philanthropy funding international organizations, but it would be in the right ones.
I also think
that's an opportunity. Elissa, I want you to jump in, but I also want to ask, is this an opportunity then to see the fact you've highlighted that, Raj, in your sort of trends piece that the funding landscape is going to change. Is this an opportunity to sort of catalyze that change, sort of make it move faster? But Elissa, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I would also say we've seen some of the highest profile philanthropists, and hats off to our data team for really crunching the numbers on a lot of these, personal and philanthropic giving. So I would encourage folks to check out that side of our work as well. But we've seen Melinda French Gates, Mackenzie Scott, kind of going through what they're focusing on. At least for Melinda French Gates, it's increasingly domestic. So I think there is, with reproductive rights, for example, which I mentioned before, there is also a lot going on internally. And I think a lot of budgets are also going to be directed for that regard. In regard to the data team's recent reports, we had a breakdown of Mackenzie Scott's giving, and most of that went toward U.S. organizations as well. So I think it's also a bit of like, okay, how much will be funded globally and how much will be funded domestically, despite, we know Melinda French Gates out of the Gates Foundation has a global interest, but still there's competing priorities here. But anyway.
Raj, did you want to jump in? I'm wondering if we're going to see the changes sort of happening faster.
I think that they need to happen faster. Will they is, an open question. I'm about to leave here. In fact, I've got to jump off of our podcast a little early today. And one of the things I'm going to be doing later today is hosting a session on humanitarian disruptors. This is inside of the Congress Hall, and the WEF is putting this session together because, there's a sense that the humanitarian space has been stuck for a long time. They've tried to reform, but they are stuck because so much of their money comes from governments, the same list of governments, basically, as you listed off from me before. And they have a lot of restrictions and they have very low risk tolerance. And so the bureaucracies that have been built are a bit slow moving, and a lot of the money doesn't get to local organizations. And so there's a desire to say, can we use technology? Can we use this moment, which is mostly a negative moment, but use it as an impetus to force more rapid change? And we're going to discuss that today with a bunch of technologists and humanitarian leaders and private philanthropists and others. So I think it's an open question, Rumbi. It's a good question. I don't think there's a real answer coming out of this year's annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, but let's see if this advances. I think this is going to be a pretty consequential year. And as I wrote in my look ahead piece, I think the whole sector is searching for a new paradigm. We're going to be maybe more forced into it than ever before. So with that, I've got to run to something, but you guys continue. It's been great to see you, and look out for some more coverage from the snowy hills here in Davos. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Raj. So, speaking of money, Elissa, there's a number that keeps playing in my head, and I'm obsessed with this number, $4,100. So it was revealed that $4,100 of PEPFAR money went to pay 4 nurses in Mozambique who carried out, I believe it's 21 abortions over the course of 2 years. This revelation came because of a CDC investigation, and it was basically rectified in the sense that the Mozambican government has now paid back this amount of money. But this amount of money, $4,100, which is like less than a drop in a bucket when you consider how much money is PEPFAR funds, may have like quite a huge impact on the PEPFAR program. How do you see this playing out?
It's a good question. I mean, I think I'm with you, Rumbi. That 4,100 number, and especially you as our health editor can attest, there's a lot to come there. And I think, if anything, it makes me feel like this is more fuel to the fire for a number of the topics that I was just speaking about. As you mentioned, this is not allowed under U.S. law. The Helms Amendment prohibits that, right? And the fact that this did happen, I think, just it creates more questions among those who are already skeptical of aid, right? Regardless of the fact that you're right, it is a drop in the bucket. It is so small in terms of, one, the money that goes from PEPFAR all across the world, and two, the impact, the lives saved through PEPFAR. So I think that it's too early to say exactly what will happen as a result of this, and we'll see how everything shakes out on Capitol Hill. But yeah, that's what I would say. I think it's not a great sign for what's ahead, is my hot take of the moment.
Understandably so, PEPFAR is up for reauthorization in March, and I have a feeling that this number is going to keep coming up throughout those discussions, and can't wait to see more coverage on this, hoping it's not going to be a huge issue, but predictably it's probably going to be. But before we actually end the podcast, one thing I wanted to say is I'm sure Trump is dominating conversations at Davos, but there's so much more going on. I've been following your Davos Dispatch, and if you haven't, please sign up to Devex Newswire. You'll get the Davos Dispatch, which is a special edition newsletter. I think we've got one more still to come out directly to your inbox. And there are so many other discussions happening around AI, oceans, and global humanitarian responses. Can you tell us some of the important discussions that you've sort of been listening in on and been part of this week?
Absolutely. So you're right. So much is going on this week. It's hard to even highlight a couple. So subscribe to the Davos Dispatch, which is through our newsletter, and you can hear more. But I mean, I'm just looking right here. I have a pamphlet from a session that I went to yesterday with both former Secretary of State John Kerry and the president of the Congo. This is just one example of a massive investment that is being launched in, I believe it's from Kinshasa to Kivu. So this is a green corridor. It's supposed to protect the environment, make jobs. It's kind of billed as the Earth's last lung. So that's just one example of an interesting conversation going on about really pushing forward conservation efforts. Other things that I've been listening into, there has been so many talks from state leaders. We've had, I believe, I think the number was something like 40 to 60 heads of state that are attending this year. So we had the UN Secretary General speak yesterday. He talked kind of about all the different things going on with the focus on the Middle East, certainly. He brought up Syria. Syria's head of state spoke also yesterday. Listened into a talk from a major leader in the Palestinian Authority, and she was talking about what does it mean, the hostage releases, the prisoner releases, the peace deal, ceasefire, and what's to come. So there's a lot of just kind of very high level folks giving their take on what's going on at the moment. Some other interesting conversations that I've had kind of on the side and on the promenade and side events are, this year's theme for Davos is collaboration in the intelligent age. So I think a lot of folks in the global development sector are trying to link their work to that theme. I spoke with the head of the Innovation Accelerator at the World Food Program a few days ago, who was telling me about all the work that they're doing trying to link up digital innovation with streamlining response, with getting food out faster, with mapping, and trying to figure out where to target. So that was also a really interesting conversation. On the flip side, there's also people saying, "Whoa, hold on. There's risks involved here, especially when it comes to humanitarian conflict and how it's used, how AI is used in warfare." So there's kind of like the most optimistic among us and the most worried among us are all coming together at the same time to hash all of these conversations out together.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I've been following like your social media posts as well. And I'm seeing a lot of these like little robots and delivery, like automated delivery services, like just on the streets of Switzerland, which is like super interesting. And this is also your first Davos. So I also want to just understand what's the environment like at Davos. I haven't been to one as yet, but what's the environment like at Davos, and sort of what kind of tips do you have for people working in development, and how can they make the most of this?
Yeah, it's a crazy place. I feel like it's a combination of, tech high flyers, AI folks, global development professionals. There's an SDG tent. So that's more kind of focused tightly on our community, and the different sessions and events going on there are obviously related to different SDGs. But it's a really interesting kind of mix and collection of people from all over the world, from corporations to organizations to philanthropies, et cetera. My kind of first impression is this mix is a funny one. It's really interesting to see all these worlds collide in different ways. And it's also set against this, as Raj mentioned, it's still snowing hard right now. I don't think you can see through the window, but it's beautiful here. And we're all kind of stuck in this little bubble on this ski town in the middle of the Alps. And it's all happening in Davos, right? So it's this kind of crazy bubble situation where folks are talking to each other. And that's the point, right? I think for all its criticism, or all the criticism that it gets, it is a center for discussion and for discourse. And that's kind of what I'm taking in so far. And you're right, the robots on the street are wild. Yesterday, I saw a robot that I think was supposed to be a dog, though it kind of reminded me of that Black Mirror episode where the dog robots are like chasing everyone around. So luckily that hasn't happened yet. They're still somewhat robotically cute. But we'll see by tomorrow how we're all faring.
And thank you so much. We're definitely looking forward to that last edition of Devex. Devex at Davos, or it's actually entitled Davos Dispatch. And in addition to that, we also have special edition episode of This Week in Global Development. We've already got one that you can check out, and we should be expecting 2 more. So please be on the lookout for those as well. Thank you so much, Elissa, for joining me, and enjoy the final days of Davos. And I hope you managed to talk about other things besides Trump.
Thank you so much, Rumbi, and thanks everyone for listening in.
Thank you.
Bye.